Today's topic is soil health in urban and rural forest ecosystems. Dr. Brian Slater is a professor and he's our extension specialist in soils. And he's with us in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And yes, that is still in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. We all have very long titles if we do the college with our talk. So with that, Brian, I'm going to stop sharing and let you share. And the floor is yours, or the screen is yours, I guess.
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to talk to you today. So I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully everyone can see that. So my goals today are to introduce the concept of soil health in forest ecosystems, whether they be in rural or urban settings. And I consider this a fairly introductory webinar because there are so many details related to soil health and soils that I think leading in with an introduction, and then perhaps in future programs, whether in person or online, we might have a broader panel of experts and we can talk more about some of these subjects. So just to outline what I'm intending to do here today is talk about soil health. So what is soil health? Where has this concept come from and where is it going? What does it mean, particularly with respect to forests? Because soil health, I think, has largely been driven along by an interest in soil health and soil quality in agricultural soils, but I think the application to other situations is very appropriate, and there's more and more interest in that. So we'll talk a little bit about why soil health might be something we're interested in related to forest ecosystems. So what is the purpose of getting interested in the health of soil in forest ecosystems? And then I'll delve a little bit more into how, what makes up this integrated idea of soil health. And we'll talk about the components of a soil health system leading into how we might assess soil health in space and time. Then I'll talk a little bit about what the real soil health challenges are in general. And in particular, I'd like to talk about something I have a bit more experience with than some of the other aspects of soil health, and that is soil compaction. And then I'll talk a little bit about management approaches. So that's what we're going to do today. So what is soil health? We can always start with a definition. Soil health is really a way of looking at the whole system from the ground up, if you like. So we're talking about the interaction between all of the ecosystem components, the hydrosphere, the pedosphere or the soil, the biosphere, the atmosphere. So all of these things react together to make ecosystems, water, soil, air, living organisms, from plants right through to us. And soil health is really about how that whole system functions, with an emphasis on the soil being kind of central to all of those things interacting together. So the USDA talked about the idea of assessing the function of ecosystems, sustaining plants, animals, and humans. So we can see that, this is not a simple concept or something that we can just go out and measure. If someone comes along with a soil health meter and tells you that this particular instrument or one particular soil test is going to tell you whether a soil is healthy or not, I would say that you I will sell you a bridge somewhere. It's not possible to do that because we're talking about a system. So we need to assess not only the whole system, but its components, and then build up an understanding of what's going on. So why would we be concerned about soil health for forest systems? It's because soil health is a component of the services that ecosystems provide to us. And when we assess soil health in space and time, as it changes or as we influence it, we're very interested in all of the services that soil might provide. So if you're thinking about a forest, wherever it is, another part of that whole system is what happens with water. And whether we're talking about water getting into the soil, moving through the soil, or moving out of the soil, or being stored there to be available for living organisms, including the forest trees, then soil health has an important role there. That's one of the functions. We're also very aware that soil, just as forests, above ground and below ground biomass, are involved in holding on to storing carbon and are important components of the carbon cycle. We know that soil is the largest terrestrial sink of carbon, but it's also the component that, one of the components that's changed the most as humans have used the soil through agriculture and forestry and other activities that we have. So carbon in the soil is absolutely essential, not only to how the world works, how nature works, how forests work, but we also know that it has this enormous effect on climate. So that particular function is very important to assess. Soils are also a place where nutrients are cycled. So we have retention, decomposition, and cycling of nutrients. And these nutrients are made available, stored, or held onto in a way so that plants and other organisms in the soil can access them. If we didn't have nutrient cycling, then we wouldn't have ecosystems, because there's a finite amount of nutrients available, and some of them are very, very limiting on our planet. So, for example, nitrogen is not in a very large supply, so we have to continually move those nutrients in and out of system components to make sure that they're available for the growth of living things. Then, of course, we're all interested in production, in what plants are able to do for us. And soils, directly are involved in that, because most of our forest plants grow in soils. And finally, soils have an influence on the health of plants through the issue of pests and diseases. So soils might be the source of those, or also healthy soils may be ones where pests and diseases are kept in relative check. So soil health influences soil function, and therefore soil health influences forest productivity and health. So another way of looking at it is that forests also help soils. So I've been fortunate over the years. I didn't have too many photographs of me in Ohio forests, but I've done quite a bit of work in Iceland in forestry, believe it or not. And here we see a picture in modern day Iceland. And why I'm showing this is because it illustrates a number of important points. So in the background here, we can see remnant Icelandic forest. So about 1200 years ago or so, there were no people in Iceland. And then the Vikings settled Iceland. At that point, a significant part of that island was covered in forests. We might not really think of them as forests because they're relatively short. Birch woodlands, we would think of them. But the land was relatively stable, and a lot of it was covered in these forests. Incidentally, you can see a nice glacier here in the background. This is one typical of Iceland. It's receding very, very quickly with climate change. And there's a large continental glacier in the background that's kind of blending in with the clouds in the sky. But here we can see in the lower land here that most of the forest vegetation was lost hundreds of years ago through the introduction of grazing animals. You can see one of them there, one sheep. We can see these small remnants of what was the original soil surface, in this case, stabilized with some willows, some low-growing willows. And we can see what's happened here to the soil. The soil has been lost by erosion, severe erosion here, right down to the parent material underneath the soil. And there are just small remnants here of the soil left. So that's a kind of an extreme example of what happens when forests are not able to cover the land in many parts of the world. So this is just illustrating more of the same. So on the left here, we can see a healthy remnant Icelandic forest. We can see these birch trees and an active understory in one of the small remnants. Less than 1% of Iceland now has these remnant forests. And on the right, again, we can see the long-term effects of soil erosion after the loss of the forest cover that had protected these relatively fragile soils over time. So my point here is that forest health and soil health are intimately related, and not just in forests, but more generally. So what might be the way we could tell whether a forest soil and a forest in that soil, working with that soil, could be considered healthy? In other words, how well is it functioning? What are the indicators of that? And these are all things that I think are kind of fairly intuitive, but worth repeating. So the first one is so central to everything that we talk about in managing soils and managing the ecosystems that they're a component of and rely on soils, and that is organic matter. And organic matter is one of those things in most cases where the more the better. So a healthy soil is going to be one that has, for its given situation, as much organic matter as possible. So this also brings me to talk a little bit about how soil health is seen. It's not a static property, and it's hard to compare the soil health from one place to another. What we should really think about in assessing soil health is, for a given soil, for its environment in which it exists, how well is it doing? What is its state and what is its trend? So we have some soils that are naturally very high in organic matter. We have soils that are naturally lower in organic matter depending on the environment in which they're found, the kind of vegetation that might be growing on them, the kind of disturbance, the nutrients and the parent material, and other features like texture and structure and nutrients all influence the natural amount of organic matter that might be in the soil. But in most cases, a healthy soil is going to have a maximum or somewhere near the maximum amount of organic matter for that particular environment. There are consequences of that, for example, in soil physical conditions. So a healthy soil is going to illustrate its health by its architecture, by its structure. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But soil is made up of solids, liquids, and gases and living organisms. And the structure is the architecture of those things. So we're going to have spaces for gases like oxygen that are needed by plants and organisms in the soil. We're going to have spaces where water can flow and be stored. And structure is that architecture, is the physical makeup of the soil that allows for that porosity. And a consequence of that too is the effects on water, infiltration, storage, drainage, and also the air in the soil. So we need all of these things to be working together to make a healthy soil, whether it's in forest or in any other kind of ecosystem. We also need, in a healthy soil, to have enough. We have enough topsoil, that is the part of the soil that's most active in terms of living organisms and cycling of nutrients and organic matter. And we need enough depth in the soil to allow adequate root growth for exploring, to obtain nutrients and water. And another aspect of a healthy soil will be resilience, the ability to resist changes that reduce the quality of the soil or its health. So, a healthy person, a healthy organism is much more likely to be able to be resilient against issues like pests and diseases, for example. And then we can go into a few more kind of details about the indicators of a healthy soil. So living organisms that are part of the system are going to need nutrients, and soil is the source of those. So we need, in a healthy soil, sufficient nutrient supply. On the other hand, we need the absence of things that are going to have detrimental effects on plant roots and organisms in the soil, such as toxins and contaminants. Soil health is a combination of physical, biological, and chemical aspects. And the population of beneficial organisms is important as an indicator of soil health. On the reverse side of that might be the organisms that we don't want to have dominating in the system. All organisms have a role in systems, but we want to keep these at a level that they're not causing damage to the ecosystem services that we're interested in extracting. And finally, resilience to those events, as I mentioned before, to perturbations, to changes such as climate change. So these are the indicators that we might want to assess, for example, in understanding the health of our soil. So how might we assess these indicators? There have been a number of systems developed for assessing soil health, mostly for agriculture, but they have just as much utility, I believe, in assessing the health of forest systems. So in assessing soil health, we need to take into account this integration of physical, chemical, and biological soil properties. So we have multiple properties in each of these areas. So there are multiple ways we might describe soil physical properties. There are multiple ways we describe chemical properties. And finally, there are multiple ways that we can assess and describe biological properties. And a system of soil health assessment is going to have to take into account all of these. So again, we can't just find a single test that's going to tell us something about the soil structure and water movement and water storage, as well as nutrients and as well as the presence of beneficial organisms in the soil. So we're going to have to be able to assess all of these things together and then combine them together in some way to get an overall assessment of soil health. So a number of people have worked on this. I provide one example there of some work done that identified 39 different soil health indicators. So I think that would be too complicated for most of us to go to multiple sites in the field and collect information either in the field or a lab or somewhere else, we certainly would probably not want to pay for 39 different tests in order to be able to assess the health of a soil. But some aspects of these will be useful in any system that actually covers the integration of all of these chemical properties. But in that particular, in Adowu's assessment, there are 16 key soil physical properties, 12 key soil chemical properties, and 11 properties related to soil biology. And in any case, we might want to assess at least some of these in each instance when we're looking at soil health. And then once we have information for these individual soil properties as indicators, then perhaps these could be combined together in some way to obtain a final assessment or a score. So increasingly, assessing soil is becoming somewhat quantitative. So we could look at measurements that we could make of these soil properties, and we could look at systems that in some way weight them and combine them together to give us a final score. So again, there are multiple different things that we could measure and describe in understanding the health of a soil, whether it's in a forest or other system. So there are a sequence or a series of soil physical properties, such as soil texture, the stability of soil aggregates, which are the structural units that make up the soil architecture, whether or not the soil has an increased bulk density or density which reduces porosity, that we call soil compaction, how much water the soil can and does store, and how dense the soil is. So all of these things might be measurements or properties that we could assess in looking at physical aspects of the soil health. And in many cases, they're things that we can describe relatively simply, such as soil texture. You know, we could assess that in a lab or even in the field using relatively simple techniques. Whereas other things might be more complicated to test. For example, aggregate stability is something that might need some lab grade equipment to assess. And I should point out that these soil physical properties are not things that are normally, typically, at least all of them are not normally typically assessed when we, for example, send a soil sample away for analysis to a lab. Increasingly, though, there are places where these things can be measured. There is equipment that's available for field use, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those options later. I would say soil biological health is really the big unknown, or the least attended to in understanding what's going on in soils. Part of the reason is that I think the low growing fruit in terms of managing and understanding soils were things like chemistry, because it is relatively easy to develop assessments and techniques for measuring things like soil pH or even organic matter and nutrients in the soil. Whereas understanding something like the health of plant roots is quite complicated. Firstly, they're beneath the soil. They're easily damaged in sampling soils. So we can't necessarily easily get numbers or an understanding of what's happening with the health of soil roots. But over time, I think techniques will be developed and are being developed, and there's a lot of activity in this area now. Another aspect of biological parts of soil health will be the carbon in soil that is being more rapidly moved and exchanged and changed. We call this active carbon, and it's a very good indicator of the health of soil. Another indicator might be soil respiration, that is associated with the carbon cycle and living organisms, how much respiration is going on, production of carbon dioxide and gaseous exchange into the soil pores and out of the soil into the atmosphere. There might be some other biological aspects too, like proteins and in particular enzyme activity that can be indicators of soil health, as well as things like what organisms are actually in the soil and what are they doing. And probably the easiest to understand of soil health indicators are the chemical ones, things like pH, electrical conductivity, which tells us about the salt load in the soil, the nutrients that are available to plants, and then things like contaminants that might be present. So a system of understanding soil health will involve assessing multiple attributes or multiple indicators and combining them together. So over time, for many different production systems, agriculture, urban systems, and forestry, multiple assessment frameworks or ways of getting to a score that we might call an index have been developed and are used to evaluate production systems and the health of soils. I'll point out that most of these frameworks have been developed for agricultural soils, but I believe they can be extended to forest systems. At Ohio State, in our school, we teach a class on urban soils, and we've been using a framework for soil health assessment that was developed for agriculture, but it has turned out to be very useful for assessing the health of urban soils. Some of these frameworks can be applied generically across multiple different systems, whether agriculture or forest. And so they have a wide range of applicability. I won't be talking about these more. I'm going to give some examples from the second class, which are frameworks targeted to particular indicators or systems. But the soil management assessment framework is used a lot in agriculture. Has been around for quite a long time now, and it has a kind of a general applicability, looking at multiple soil indicators for assessing soil health. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this one, the Cornell Soil Health Assessment Manual, which was developed about 10 or so years ago at Cornell University, and is used extensively for looking at agricultural soils in particular, but I think it has broad applicability. So let me just delve a little bit more into how this thing works. And if you're interested, the document is available online and can be downloaded from their soil health site at Cornell. So it's called a comprehensive assessment of soil health, and it involves assessing multiple soil indicators and combining them together to get a score that can be used to make comparisons between soils, between systems, between management practices, and over time. So I recommend, if you're interested in soil health, getting a hold of this manual. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about how it works, because I think it's very illustrative of how soil health can be assessed. So it works through the process that I've already kind of mentioned. So the goal is to assess key soil properties, physical, chemical, and biological. So for a given soil, for a given system, if you're making comparisons, say, between different soils in different places or under different management practices, say over time, we might be trying to assess whether the soil's improving or whether we have problems with the soil. And so we might want to use this in multiple times in multiple places. And so we're going to assess soil physical, chemical, and biological properties. So the first thing we're going to do is identify which of these are going to be appropriate for the system that we're going to look at. And then it's a sort of semi-quantitative system. So what happens is that there are ways of evaluating the properties that we've analyzed and giving them an individual score based on some kind of relationships that have been developed between those attribute values and the end product that we want, such as production or carbon sequestration or some other thing that we're trying to assess. So there will be a relationship, a relatively simple curve in the case of the Cornell system. So some relationships are used to interpret the values of the soil properties we've assessed. And finally, these can be combined together to provide a kind of soil health report card. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples about how that works to illustrate what can be done to assess soil health using this system. So what do I mean by these relationships? So there are, in the Cornell system, three really simple and basic kinds of relationships that have been derived from multiple experiments, from experience over time. They're semi-quantitative. We're not saying that we have very complex equations or relationships here. The idea is to have simple ways to interpret what we're seeing. So let's give an example of soil pH. So we know that there are specificities of soil pH for different plants, for example. Different trees have a range of pH under which, depending on where these species developed and the kinds of environments and soil have evolved, we might have soils that are more comfortable with somewhat slightly acid soil conditions. We may have others that have developed in areas where we have more alkaline conditions, and these these might be species that will not do so well under more acid conditions. So just talking about soil pH, we can get an understanding that that there is some kind of optimal, or at least a range where for our particular species or ecosystem. And so this might be a relationship where there is a kind of optimal curve, and then outside the optimum, then soil health might be down suffer because our ecosystem services are going to be compromised in some way. So that's a fairly simple relationship I think we can understand. So for example, we might have certain trees that like slightly acid to neutral pH. So this curve might show that below about pH 5 or something like that, we're going to get poor production. And then if we go over, say, pH 8 or something like that, we may have some compromises as well. So obviously, there's going to be somewhere in the middle there that we're going to do well. So if we measure a soil pH of 5, then we know that soil health is going to be compromised in some way. So that's one simple example. Another example might be relationships where the soil attribute or indicator is better when we have more of it. And soil organic matter is a pretty good example generally. So we can see this fairly simple relationship for a given situation, for a given environment, for a given soil, for a given system, the more organic matter we have, the better the condition. On the other hand, if soil organic matter has been degraded through mismanagement or other effects, then we may have lower soil quality based on that individual attribute. And another example of a different kind of curve or a different kind of relationships may be something like soil compaction, some detrimental property of a soil. So the less compaction, the better. So a soil that has a high level of compaction, which we might measure, say, with something like a penetrometer, by measuring the bulk density or the porosity of the soil, we could see that that high values would be associated with relatively poor soil health. So that's how these ratings work. And it's really up to the individual person and situation to develop these relationships and understand them. So let me work through one example. So for example, here is a set of curves from the Cornell manual, showing one example of some relationships with organic matter. But this relates to some agricultural soils, and these here, these reference ranges of soil texture. So one thing that we know from many experiments and experience is that coarser textured soils typically have lower levels of organic matter, and it's harder to build that organic matter up. So that if we, for example, were able to have, if we assess a certain level of soil organic matter in a coarse textured soil, it's going to have a different relative level of soil health than, say, a fine textured or clay soil. So there are slightly different curves here for each of these soil textures. And there are various ways that we combine these together. And then another aspect of the Cornell system is these fairly simple scoring functions or classes. So we can see this kind of traffic light assessment system where low soil health attributes or measurements are in this range here, given the red color, and the green light would be given if you have values up here. So we might look at a clay soil with measured 5% organic matter, which is really high, really. We can see here that we would measure that on this scale at about 70 to 80% for assessing this particular attribute in a soil. So the steps in working through an assessment of soil health in the Cornell system involve sampling soil, so collecting some soil in the field. It's possible that some of the measurements can actually be made in the field too. So for example, we could assess soil texture fairly simply using the texture by feel method. This may be sufficient to provide an assessment for soil texture. There might be other things that we could measure in the field rather than necessarily sending soils into a lab. But typically we would collect multiple samples in the field to do an assessment. And then these indicator properties are going to be analysed in some way using a lab, using some equipment. In some way, we're going to measure all of the properties that we're interested in, such as soil pH or soil organic matter, or whatever we're interested in assessing. Then we are going to evaluate these distributions to give us some information about where we are on these curves for each of the indicator properties. Then we will generate a cumulative distribution for all of these properties and assess the indicator scores and eventually a final score. So here is an example of one of the Cornell Soil Health Test Reports sheets for a particular soil, so that there's some general information. So Cornell actually have a service where they will assess the soil health of samples for a price, and there are other labs in the country that are beginning to do this kind of assessments. Again, mostly they're done for agricultural soils, but there's no reason that the system cannot be adapted for forest soils. So here we can see that there are a series of properties that are assessed in this case between physical, biological, and chemical. Not as many as the 39. In this case, we're going to have about 15 or 14 or so that are considered to be important soil properties in the Cornell system. So, for example, amongst physical properties, we would have aggregate stability, which is actually measured with some equipment, available water capacity, that is how much water the store can store, the hardness of the surface. This is measured with a penetrometer, and the penetrometer resistance of the subsurface. So there are 4 examples of indicators that are used. And so the values are recorded here for each of these. So, and then these would be assessed according to those curves and given a rating. So we can see the red light here for aggregate stability in this particular case for this particular soil. So it had an aggregate stability of 12%. That is basically that 12% of the water of aggregates was stable over time when the soil was agitated in water. And so here we can see it has a very low rating, which would indicate that there are going to be soil health challenges in this soil, such as aeration, infiltration, the ability of plant roots to get into the soil. We can see that water capacity as kind of a moderate kind of limitation. We can see here that in this case, this soil relatively of physical structure because its compaction was relatively low. Then we can look at biological properties such as organic matter, active carbon, potentially mineralizable nitrogen, and a root health rating. So some things related to biological properties. Again, you could see values that have then been interpreted against these curves, and some interpretation in terms of what the issues might be for production and long-term use of the soil. And finally, here are some chemical properties: pH, phosphorus, potassium, and minor elements. Now, all of these attributes can be varied by the site depending on what things are considered important for the system. So we can see that all of these ratings have been combined together and over a soil that's considered to have. So one more quick example here of a soil that scores a lot more in the green zone. So this could be a way that we might compare different soils from different places or different management practices over time, or different environments that might be present at our different sites. So again, you're just seeing different values that have been interpreted. So compared to the last site, this site has a much higher aggregate stability, which would indicate its resilience against change, against compaction or something like that, might be far superior to the previous soil. So here we can see all these things add up to a much higher overall soil quality score and a final class of high. So that's how this system works. So again, a semi-quantitative system that can be applied based on a large number or a relatively large number of attributes that can be actually measured on site. So let's talk a little bit more about what all this means. What are the issues in forest ecosystems related to soil health? And I'm just going to talk about these in general for the moment, but then I'm going to talk about one to give a sort of example of how assessing soil health might help us understand the systems and the processes that are happening that create these challenges. So, for example, amongst the soil physical issues that we might find in forest ecosystems, I think compaction is one of the most important. So there are many forest operations related to forest systems where soil is disturbed. Certainly forest systems are known for typically being less disturbed than, say, agricultural systems, but physical disturbance is still an issue at various places and at various times in forest systems. So we can have the formation of ruts, we can have soil erosion, and all of these might be cases where forest soils don't have quite the same issues as agricultural soils, but in particular times and places and locations where there is disturbance, then these issues can be just as important as in agricultural soils. Another physical issue might be the effects of fire on soils. Soil health challenges related to chemical soil properties will be nutrient deficiencies, nutrient imbalances, nutrient losses, contamination, for example, and off-site effects of nutrients that are applied and might get into water supplies, for example, and soil pH. And then biological issues relate to disturbance impacts on the balance of soil organisms in the soil, things like the presence of invasive species. And then finally, there's an overall thing, and that is climate change, which is going to influence all of these. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not going to be able in the time, nor do I have the expertise to talk about a number of these soil properties that feed into the soil health assessment system, and maybe that will be an opportunity for some future programs to talk about chemical and biological aspects of soil health, and other experts could be brought in to talk about those. But I'm just going to burrow a little bit deeper into this concept of soil compaction as it relates to forest ecosystems. So, here we can see where compaction has become a problem. So compaction may not be a problem everywhere in a forest, but we know there are places where this is going to be an issue and where it will influence soil health. So the overall effect of compaction is to reduce the large pore spaces. And, we might think that when a soil is affected by a compression load, such as a wheeled vehicle or even animals or people doing things on the soil, it might be that we expect that the soil solid materials are going to be forced closer together due to those compacted and compressive forces. But usually what happens is it's the large pores, the big pores in the soil that are affected by compaction. So if we measure the pore size distribution in the soil, it's these macro pores, the larger pores or holes in the soil, the large cracks, etc. These pores are the ones that get affected most by soil compaction. Compaction is typically caused by the movement of heavy equipment on soils, particularly wheel traffic. So during site preparation, any management operations, during harvesting, and even processing on site, these are when most of the compaction effects happen. In urban environments where we have forest trees, urban forestry, street trees, etc., then severe compaction is almost the norm. So we have severe disturbance of the soil during construction and normal urban development. We have ongoing compaction through wheel traffic and the influence of people on the site. Compacted soils are almost the norm in many urban environments. So what are the outcomes? Why does it matter? Well, typically the end result is lower soil porosity, especially of the large pores, the pores that carry water into and through the soil. This can be measured as a higher density of the soil. So we're really interested in the porosity, that is how much of the soil is pore space, and also the continuity or how well those soil pores connect together to allow water movement into and through the soil. Typically, compacted soils impede water movement, that is the infiltration of water into the soil or drainage of water through and out of the soil, but also influence gas exchange in the root zone. So if we've got compacted soil, then many of the soil pores are not going to be open and allow water to move through. If we've got mostly fine pores, those pores are going to hold on to water very strongly and not let the water move through, and the pores are going to quickly fill with water and not let oxygen be available to plant roots and microorganisms in the soil. And because of that, we will get restricted nutrient uptake due to compaction. So these are all compaction effects that influence soil health. Just looking at this in a little bit more detail, we can think of soils being made up of three components, the gas, the liquid, and the solid. So we might think soils mostly are solid materials, but in fact, a healthy soil system has a mix of each of these. Somewhere near about half or less soil solids, maybe a third of the soil can be water available to plants, although this is going to be quite dynamic over time, and at least 20% air in the soil will result in highest productivity and other ecosystem services being maximized. On the other hand, as soils get wet, we know that soils pores are going to fill with water and plant roots and other organisms are going to thrive as long as there is at least 10% porosity filled with air. So 10% of the soil volume is going to have airspace that has exchangeable air in it. But if we compact the soil, what happens is the proportion of solids in the whole soil volume increases. We've got rid of these large macropores, and that means that there's less space for both air and for air. And then if we drop below this 10%, then we do have actual effects on plant roots and organisms in the soil. And then there are even just physical effects related to the size of the spaces in the soil, because it's these spaces where living organisms, including plant roots, microorganisms, and larger soil organisms live. So if we compact a soil, so a normal good soil might have a bulk density here less than 1.2 or so, 1.3 maybe, in agricultural soils, we start to see the volume of the soil that's not accessible by any organisms becomes larger as the soil solids increase. And then larger soil organisms are going to be affected even when the soil bulk density is relatively good. As it increases, then there's going to be no spaces for larger organisms like worms, nematodes, etc. And even very small organisms like protozoans are going to be affected. There's going to be very little space for them to move and grow once the soil gets fairly compacted. So how does compaction then affect soil quality? What are the things that happen? Firstly, compaction might affect the ability of seeds to germinate and then push out of the soil to establish. Compaction restricts tree growth, including the number and size of leaves, which may eventually lead to branch dieback, and then other effects, including susceptibility to pests and environmental stresses. All of these things depend on other soil properties. So what are the moisture conditions, the soil texture, for example, soil structure, and organic matter content. So the more organic matter, the better the soil architecture, and the more resilient the soil, and also climate. I've just got a simple illustration here, not the best photographs, but this was some work done by one of my students, Rebecca Torrado, several years ago, looking at the effects of compaction on specific tropical trees. So not that many experiments have been done like this, but in this particular case, she actually compacted soil by taking layers of soil and dropping them from a certain height until they reached a certain density, and then layering these affected dense layers together, and then growing different three different tree species to see what actual effects there were. So here we can see compaction, two different textures, and we can see how compaction affected the clay soil on the right far more than it affected a coarser textured soil, a sandy clay loam. So the clay soil on the right, you can see an increasing bulk density, increasing compaction as you go from left to right. And there are two different tree species here. So here we can see major effects on roots as we go from a bulk density of 1.15 up to a bulk density of 1.4. So what do we do about compaction if we measure it and it's downgrading soil health? Typically, prevention is much more likely to be successful than trying to do anything about soil compaction. Soil compaction, particularly in forest ecosystems, is something that is fairly difficult to accomplish and can be and could be very expensive. So how do we deal with it? Well, firstly, reducing the traffic of heavy equipment. So, and this traffic effect happens mostly on wet soils. Dry or frozen soils are typically far more resilient than wet soils. So minimizing operations when soils are wet can go a long way to preventing the impact of traffic and causing soil compaction. Obviously, using smaller, lighter equipment or vehicles that have less points of compaction, such as track vehicles, or using low pressure tires, can do things that will minimize soil compaction. The number of times we pass over and that the weight of our load is going to make a big difference as well. So minimizing passes and loads. And also having equipment that doesn't track over large areas of soil. For example, using equipment that has a long reach, or even protecting the surface with some kind of protective mat or other way of keeping and mitigating the effect of the compactive load, particularly of wheel traffic. And finally, watching the number of kinds of traffic events that happen. So even just sequencing, doing things at the back of the lot before we do things at the front, and moving towards the front of the lot means that we're going to minimize the number of passes that might compact the soil. So there are a few examples of things that we might do to prevent compaction. Once it's happened, though, we have limited things we can do. Anything that increases soil organic matter is going to help restore and rehabilitate soils. But I can tell you, compaction takes typically a fairly long time to do anything about. We know that in urban systems, we might be able to do something like soil coring or vertical mulching, but in forest systems, this is something that's going to be relatively limited. In even things like tillage and deep tillage that have a short-term value maybe in opening up the soil and reducing compaction. In some high-value situations, even things like soil replacement. An example of this might be mine spoil restoration, where we might actually bring soil in to a site in order to reduce the compaction. Eventually, time might be the best thing that can be done about compacted soil. Natural systems are going to eventually work through to better soil quality, but we're talking about very long time frames typically. So there's some examples of how we might do something about compacted soils. Before I finish up, I just wanted to mention that one of the biggest challenges to improve soil health in the long term is going to be climate change and adapting to that. I'm going to finish up in a moment and open up for answering some questions, I hope. Some references here to the Cornell Soil Health System, the USDA's main site on soil health, and the Soil Health Institute, which mostly works in the area of agricultural soils, but are increasingly involving themselves in the broader aspects of soil health. And their websites are all great places for accessing various resources on soil health. If you're interested, if anyone's interested in a lot more detail on soil health indicators and indices and how they work, there's a reference here to a review I did on that subject a couple of years ago, published in a book on managing soil health for sustainable ag. So I'm going to stop sharing. I think hopefully we have some questions that people are going to ask, and I'll see what I can do to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Great presentation. Brings back some things that I probably should have in the forefront of my brain, but it's always good to hear those things. As we talk with woodland owners and why things aren't kind of going the way they think, sometimes soils is not the place where they start, and we probably should start there more often than not. And you're right, especially on the urban side, that's probably one of those areas that when we talk about soils and the compaction and the fact that with all the new construction, lots of times that top layer doesn't come back, it gets flipped, and what soils are in their yards are not what was mapped 20 years ago when it was a crop field or whatever. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point, Kathy, especially as we talk about greening up our communities and landscaping our backyards. That's a big issue. In my yard in particular, the soil is not great. It's not great. It's just what they turned over when they built, and then they left it. So every time I plant, I have to build up that soil and add some good stuff, a lot of good stuff, if I'm going to have it grow well.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have some questions. Laura asks, leaves on top of the soil are organic matter. Beyond roots, what other organic matter is within or under the soil?
Okay, so that's a great question. So soils, as I mentioned, are made up of the solid components, and those solid components include, plus the gas and water and living organisms. But the solid part of the soil also contains organic matter. It's not just minerals. They're not just mineral particles, right? So organic matter starts, as you mentioned, as living organisms, parts of living organisms like leaves and stems and trees that fall over and grass roots and the roots of plants that live and die. But over time, those organic materials are broken down into different components or different materials. So some of those will be mineral, but some of them remain as organic matter. So think of a compost heap as a good example of what happens. Okay, so we mix all of these organic materials together, but over time it's broken down and changes into humus, or an organic material that has relatively long-term stability. And the value of that, if we dig that into our garden, it will improve the quality of the soil by providing nutrients, by helping hold on to water, by introducing food for microorganisms that are then going to release nutrients out into the soil. So that organic matter, that long-term organic matter that's incorporated into the soil is soil organic matter. But actually the main component of soil organic matter does not come originally from plants. It appears that the bulk of soil organic matter comes from microorganisms in the soil. So we have in a handful of soil millions and millions of bacteria and fungi and other very small organisms. And these live and die. Just imagine, they're living and dying by the millions every day. And their cells become part of the soil. They become part of the soil organic matter. So eventually soils have several percent soil organic matter. Soil organic matter can go as high as 30% in a wetland soil, for example. Typical agricultural soils and forest soils might be in the range of 1 to 5%, something like that. And soils that have been disturbed or in very dry places or places where plants don't grow very well, they may have less than 1% organic matter. And many agricultural soils and even forest soils in Ohio that have been strongly disturbed, many urban soils may have less than 1% of that humus or organic matter in them. So that's kind of a quick answer. Maybe it wasn't that quick, but there are multiple aspects. But organic matter is part of soil, and it may start as material on the top of soil, but eventually it becomes incorporated. The other thing to say about that is that organic matter has carbon. It may, up to one quarter or 1/3 of that soil organic matter is actually the element carbon, and that is a very important part of the carbon cycle on our planet. So if it's in the soil, then it's not in the atmosphere. If it's in the soil for a long period of time, then it's not contributing to global warming and climate change out in the atmosphere. So we want to try and maximize that as much as we can.
Okay. We have an anonymous attendee that asks, what time of year is best to conduct soil tests? With all the rain lately, how much topsoil runoff is typical each year? And then his third one is how much nutrient value is lost. So if you need me to repeat those one at a time, I can.
Kathy, start with the first one.
So what time of year is best to conduct soil tests?
I would say the time of year best to conduct soil test is when you're happiest to go out and do it. I really don't, that there might be some reasons to pick a particular season or a particular time. You don't, if you're going to take some soil in a bag and take it somewhere, you probably just don't want to put a sloppy mess in the bag and close up the bag and send it somewhere. Also, most soil that you're going to sample, you're not going to be able to do measurements like these physical property measurements on it anyway. There may be some reasons why you might not want to get measurements at particular times of the year. So, for example, soil nitrogen, which might be an important indicator of soil nutrient capacity or soil organic matter, may be influenced immediately after some soil disturbance. So you may actually increase the amount of nitrogen, or you may reduce it depending on what happens. So I would avoid times or close times to when there's been major disturbance events. But other than that, I don't think there's a real restriction on when you should sample a soil and get it tested. Second part.
Okay. With all the rain lately, how much topsoil runoff is typical each year?
Well, that depends entirely on the place and the condition of the soil. The loss of topsoil depends on many things, and we could talk, we could have multiple sessions on soil erosion, even in forest ecosystems. But the steeper the slope, the more erosion, the less cover on the ground, whether that be actively growing vegetation or the residue, or trash or something that's covering up the soil, cover crop. So bare soil erodes much more easily. Compacted soil erodes much more easily. Soil that's got actively growing plants and living organisms that are healthy. So a healthy soil is much less likely to erode. So all of those things add up. But also, the intensity and the amount of rainfall, and also how wet the soil is. So a dry soil typically will not erode. But once the soil gets very wet and its aggregates start to break down and we get runoff, we get high velocity water moving over the surface, then we get a lot more. So it's just really hard to answer that question specifically, how much, but we want to keep it as little as possible, that's for sure.
And then the last one was how much nutrient value is lost? Probably with that runoff.
Well, most plant, the closer to the surface you are, the more plant nutrients typically. The most nutrient rich material is the organic matter on the surface of the soil in a forest, for example. The next most important part is what we might call the topsoil, or the O or A horizons, and they're very high in nutrients. So we may have 20 or 30% of the total plant nutrients in the top 10 or 20 centimeters, the top 6 inches of the soil. And if you lose that 6 inches, then you're going to lose, 20, 30% of your total nutrient load. Over time, higher soils, most soils have lost 30% of their organic matter and 50% of their plant nutrients over time, just through things like agriculture or even forest clearing. So again, just putting specific, numbers, it depends on the situation. But if you lose a couple of inches of soil, you're going to lose up to half of the nutrients that plants get. And there may be deeper nutrients in the soil, but if plant roots can't get down there, they're not going to get those nutrients.
Okay, so Carolyn asks, how deep does the penetrometer go to measure the subsurface hardness?
That's a great question. So a penetrometer will push in. So most penetrometers are human driven. So the ones that we use are a fairly simple pressure meter, on a sharp tip that you push into the soil. So it's got it's just like pushing a rod with a point on it into the soil, and it will measure the number of pounds per square inch. I could have given some data, but usually if you get up to 300 pounds per square inch on that tip, plant roots can't grow. So how far you can push it really depends on how hard the soil is. So we've had classes out in urban soils and agricultural soils in Ohio. I had a student working on agricultural soils in Northwest Ohio. She was able to push her penetrometer in a no-till situation down to a meter, down to 3 feet into the soil. Whereas the conventional till plots, she could only push it in 6 to 12 inches, depending on the time of the year and the condition. Out in urban sites in Columbus, Ohio, we've had 6 or 7 classes go out with penetrometers for the last few years. We rarely can push them in more than a few inches, and this is because these soils are highly compacted. We get up to 90% of sites with a PSA at the surface or within 10 centimeters, a couple of inches of the surface, having PSA of more than 300. So we're talking about urban lots that have been derelicted lots where the city of Columbus has come in and knocked a house over because it had been abandoned. And these are not places where typically the soil's been looked after, I can tell you that. So in answer to your question, how far can you push it in? I would say that the further you can push it in, the better your soil quality. But in a good forest soil situation where we might have bulk density of 1.1, 1.2 in the organic matter, and then getting into the topsoil, you should easily be able to push it through the topsoil, but then you might get held up with higher natural bulk density in the subsoil once the subsoil starts to build up. So in the glacial deposits, glacial till under about 2/3 of Ohio, the bulk density is typically about 1.8. You will not push a penetrometer into that.
Okay. So David asks, why no mention of the importance of mycorrhizae and soil ecosystem health generally?
Time and expertise. So I didn't talk much about soil biological aspects of soil health. They're absolutely essential. I would say the most important aspects of soil health. Mycorrhizae are definitely a part of that. Fungi, if not the most important, nearly the most important group of organisms in all ecosystems. And mycorrhizae are essential fungal organisms that connect between the soil and plants, that make that link, that help provide nutrients to plants. And they're also great indicators of soil health. So mycorrhizal activity is a very good indicator of soil health. So I didn't neglect it through choice, just time. And also, it's not my area of expertise, but I would really love to have a couple of our other experts talk about biological soil health, and in particular, the soil fungi, which I think are absolutely essential organisms.
We can definitely follow up with that one. Next question. Joe Campbell asks, or he says, great presentation, Brian. You mentioned in your final slide that climate change will have the greatest impact on the ability for forested soils to recover. Can you elaborate on why?
Well, I would say the biggest reason is that most of our forests are adapted to the environment under our current climate. So, we're talking about, largely natural systems or systems where we've got organisms, including trees that, have been there or ought to be there for relatively long periods of time. So the plants have already grown or ought to be growing for long periods in a particular set of conditions to which they are well adapted. So, we are not growing southern forest species in Ohio. We are not growing northern hardwood forest species in Alabama, right? We're growing with what we've got now. So, large amounts of climate change are going to stress all of those natural systems. That's the first thing. The second thing are the more micro changes. So we're going to have places where particular components of the ecosystem are going to be affected. So if soils get hotter, that's going to change the balance of microorganisms in the soil. We know that soil processes speed up as soils get warmer. We know that as soils get wetter or drier, different effects happen, and it's going to vary from place to place. So for example, Ohio might become not only warmer, but wetter. And so that's going to, in soils that are already wet and saturated for a month or two, or even much longer each year, we're going to have longer periods of saturation, which is going to cause more stresses. It's going to cause more interaction with the things that humans do in forests. Like, for example, if we got wetter soils, we're going to get more compaction. So Joe, there is just so many ways that climate change will influence just about every aspect of what goes on. As temperatures warm, we will get a much higher breakdown rate of soil organic matter typically. So we're going to get more soil respiration and more loss of carbon into the atmosphere. So they're just some examples. I could, again, this might be something, if climate change effects on soils is something we want to talk about, I would love to spend some time talking about that in more detail.
Consider yourself invited. Okay, so the next question from Tarek is, he says, thank you for the very important presentation. His question is, can we use the mobile application of SHC in any country?
I am not sure whether that application can be used everywhere or whether there are restrictions on that. So that might be one I would want to follow up on. I don't know. So we're talking about a software program that can be used for assessing soil health. And, I might need to follow up on whether that's something that can be accessed outside the United States.
Okay. Next, Fred asks, is the subject of invasive earthworms omitted due to being too big a problem and too new to be included in your excellent presentation?
No, probably should. I did talk about invasive species in one line of one slide. That is, man, there's just so many other aspects of this. Yes. And I consider, in many instances, non-native earthworm species to be invasive, and so it wasn't specifically mentioned, but definitely earthworms, European earthworms, in many natural and even managed forest systems are invasive. The question is, what can or ought we to do about it? And that's an probably an intractable problem. And in the case of the replacement of native earthworm species or the introduction of earthworms over large areas where there wouldn't have been any earthworms in systems, particularly our systems, forest and prairie systems in the northern half of the United States, I think that, and many people, maybe this audience is not aware of this, but most of our earthworms in this part of the world are introduced species, and they have replaced any native species that were here. But in many cases, we didn't even have earthworms in the soil, and they can be highly advantageous in soils. We know that, but they can also have detrimental effects, particularly in the the mixing of soil and loss of organic matter that takes place because of that. I'm not an expert on this, so again, earthworms in forest systems might be a wonderful thing to have a talk about sometime.
We have had a talk or two on the invasive earthworms earlier in the year, and that recording.
That was for WWW.
Oh, that was for WWW.
Yeah, it was for our conference, but we could
certainly we could
tear it back.
Yeah, we could certainly put one here and cover that. So next question, Bill asks, what are your thoughts about allelopathy such as ailanthus or walnut near tomatoes, etc.?
Um, a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I think we all know about that, and I certainly had. In fact, the first garden I ever, I moved from a southern clime to Ohio about 24 years ago now. And my first garden in Columbus, I saw all these wonderful tomatoes people were growing. I called them tomatoes back then, but anyway, why were in Upper Arlington, Ohio, in Columbus, could I grow only very crappy tomatoes? And the fact that I had a very, very nice black walnut tree, in very close proximity, taught me about that effect very, very quickly. So we know it's there. Again, it's not my area of expertise, and Kathy might know some folks that could talk to you all about allelopathy.
I think we acknowledge that certain plants have those issues. I have an ancient copy of a Forest Service publication that lists all the plants that black walnut impact. And I finally scanned it and made it a digital so I could access it, because that's probably one of the most common questions I get is the allelopathy with black walnut. But as we look at invasive species, we now know that garlic mustard and ailanthus, they all have some combination of allelopathy, which is what makes them successful invasive plants. I mean, they just fight everybody off. But I don't know that any of us feel like we're experts at it. So if we could find someone that wants to talk about that, I think it'd be an interesting topic, because it comes up all the time.
I'm sure there's warfare out there between all of these plants. Even in our mixed coniferous and deciduous systems, whether it's allelopathy or just the effects of different kinds of litter. For example, from softwood, from pines, etc. They all have multiple effects on other species. And we also know that there are benefits. Catherine, we were just talking before I started this webinar about things like alley cropping and agroforestry, where there are benefits of growing multiple species together, but you also have to watch how they influence each other. Right. And even in agriculture, there are issues related to, it's great to have cover crops. Not necessarily all cover crops work well with all crops. Depending on some of these aspects. And I think there's a large area of research on how organisms grow and work together, particularly in forest systems. But it tells us something that sometimes we know in agriculture, that going beyond monoculture to more complex systems can get us some benefits. The same goes in forest systems, I think.
Oh, yeah. So we had a couple more. Roy asks, in undisturbed forest, does the root mass grow upward into organic layer?
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, yes. And again, depending on the species, there are connections between that organic duff layer or the layer at the surface, which consists of decomposing leaves and plant parts or microorganisms right up to larger organisms that are the detritivores that break down that material. And and plant roots do access, it's part of the soil. So plant roots do access that, particularly very fine roots. It depends on the species. Not all species do that. And then there are, where does a root end in a microhyphae from a mycorrhizae, where does one thing, mycorrhizae typically will highly, there'll be fungal hyphae right throughout a forest that are part of that surface organic matter layer. In many of our forests, of course, that material is highly disturbed now. I'm sure 300 years ago it looked quite different than it does now, and I'm sure plant roots were penetrating that material and exploring it. again, this really depends on the species and how they work and what kind of forests they were in. And I think the understory, the shorter growing plants in the understory and low story are more actively involved in exploring that, and then their roots become part of the soil organic matter that is linked back to the woody species, larger woody species that are in the system. I don't know, Kathy, you might be able to answer a little bit more about that. I mean, I know plant roots do penetrate into that layer, and in fact, in many managed systems, you don't want to disturb that layer because you will disturb those plant roots. We know that's particularly true, say, for orchard crops and other tree, valuable tree crops. Disturbing that surface can actually disturb the roots and then affect productivity.
No, I think it's true. And it's like, when you're working with landowners that, where I first started seeing a lot of that disturbance was when folks started getting four-wheelers and that and running them through the woods, and the impact on the soil and then the impact on the trees. The two weren't always connected in folks' minds. And so you really do have to kind of talk about that, where those roots are and, what they're trying to take over in order to be able to survive in those systems. So he had a second question. Does weed cloth placed under mulch restrict root mass growth? I wouldn't think so.
Just intuitively, I would say yes, but certainly would restrict larger roots. Will finer roots get through and stuff? I think it would depend on the structure of that. But we're talking about geomembranes that are basically there to stop root growth. So upward growth of roots, right, and the connection to the surface would definitely be affected. Now, again, how serious that is or how that might affect productivity, I don't have direct knowledge of that, but just intuitively would think so, yes.
Karen asks, how does fire affect soil health? Another one of those, Brian.
Yeah, these are great, actually really great questions and sort of researchable questions. But fire, fire has can have enormous effects. It can have positive effects and negative ones. And again, it might depend on the heat of the fire. And we know that periodic burns and natural burns, obviously have a role and a place in many forest ecosystems, and even any managed systems. We know that native peoples across the world, I'll be very interested in what is now being learnt about how the first Australians, native Aboriginal Australians, used fire to manage landscapes. And, they knew how to do it, not to get the burns too hot, so that they maintained some of the surface organic matter in the areas they burnt. And so again, it depends on the heat, but a very hot fire will burn up and degrade all of the surface organic matter cover. A hot fire will actually heat the surface of the soil to hundreds of degrees. Will kill everything, all the microorganisms, will break down soil organic matter that's there, and will even will even start to affect the structure and general overall quality of the soil. So it can be a major disturbance, as well as influencing the health and growth of plants. If it's a fire that actually kills and consumes the understory and even the trees. But short-term fires have always been part of many landscapes. And so, they can result in the mineralization of organic matter, that is, the release of plant nutrients. They can clean up weeds and invasive species. There's all kinds of things that properly managed fires, and in many parts of the world, it's not necessarily true Northern American forests, but I know in Australia and Africa, fires have always been a part of actually maintaining forest systems. Many, the commonest Australian trees, eucalypts and other Australian trees, for example, have to be scarified by heat. The seeds have to be scarified by heat in order to germinate. So fires are needed there to regenerate, senescing trees and in older forests. So there are values of fire, but typically where fire's out of control, or its interval isn't controlled, you've got too much understory or dry material, or the fire burns too hot, then you will destroy the organic part of soil. You will influence soil organisms and even influence the chemistry and physics of the soil through ways I already mentioned today.
Okay. Anthony asks, list of native plants that would best combat compaction.
Native plants. Okay. I'm going to punt on this one because I'm not the expert on plant species. So maybe someone else. But first, just about any native plant, if you can get it to grow, is going to have value. I would say that anything that adds organic matter, anything that reestablishes natural cycling of nutrients and water and air into the soil, anything that's kind of deep rooted. So I would look for plants like that. I would look for things that grow relatively quickly and get their roots into the soil. I would think anything with good taproot, fast taproot development. So so in agriculture, we use things like radishes and stuff that open the soil up really, really quickly. But, I do caution, I mentioned that doing something about compaction, it's relatively slow. So it's hard to get things to grow to begin with, but if you can get something to grow and it can get its roots in, that's going to have a positive effect. But, only minor effects typically. I don't think there's anything you can just throw out there and all of a sudden you're going to have no compaction. It doesn't really work that way. But our foresters here might have some comments. I don't have that knowledge myself.
I mean, it's tough. I can remember in my early career days trying to plant some trees in an old agricultural field that had been put into CRP for a riparian buffer. And it was so compacted. I mean, we were almost using the dibble bars like spears, throwing them, trying to get down enough to open up a hole big enough to put bare root seedlings in. And I just felt like, we were making this effort, but to what extent, because they really didn't survive. We had a few that survived, but it was an impossible site to try to plant on. And you're right, you want something that will penetrate, but you got to get it to live in order for that taproot to penetrate. So it's not an easy answer. So last question, Brian. Barry asks, in your Iceland example early in the presentation, was the degradation in the environment due to human settlement with grazing or due to warming climate?
Well, the answer is it was mostly human. So warming climate, at about the time of human settlement in Iceland, the climate was warming, and that actually influenced the fact that people could go to Iceland and settle it and do quite well, although there was a struggle against the environment. But temperatures were getting warmer in Iceland at the time, and then a couple of hundred years later, temperatures headed lower, what we call the Little Ice Age in Northern Europe, and it got much colder in Iceland, and in fact it was hard to grow anything. From about 870, 871, when Iceland was settled, the people were, you may think of them as Vikings with horned helmets or whatever, but they were actually mostly farmers. And they arrived in Iceland and they saw this green place, and but it was covered with these little trees. So they knocked them over. The main reason they took the trees out was to burn them for heat in the winter. So winter's cold and long. And so, they lived in turf houses and they had to have heat in those houses. And so they cut down the birch trees, and then they introduced firstly swine, firstly pigs, and then sheep and goats. And when they released them out there, any regrowth of the birch and willows was prevented. So over very large areas, within 100 or 200 years, nearly all the birch was gone. So it was really humans that did it. Plus the fact that it's a difficult, cold climate. So and the soils are not very resilient. They're made of volcanic ash mostly, which is very light, low bug density, and it blows very easily. So if you remove the trees and the vegetation, then the soil can erode quickly. But I would, if you want to put blame on it, there wasn't severe soil erosion until the humans came. And after humans came, it happened very quickly. In 100 or 200 years, most of the soil was disturbed.
Humans, the ultimate invasive species. Okay. I think, let me check. We made it through the questions. I'm going to go ahead and post the link to the continuing ed credit survey.